Good afternoon, this is Nigel Forster for Photo Training for You. We're in the middle of the Brecon Beacons on a very bright, sunny, warm day in July. Bright overhead sunshine, not fantastic for photography, but I've got a group of students here. I'm going to show a couple of thoughts on composition that perhaps to give them some thoughts on how they might approach this when perhaps the day is a little bit more promising. As I mentioned, lovely to be out in, but perhaps slightly less promising for photography. So what we've got is a classic backdrop of the Brecon Beacons, mountain landscape with a prominent mountain. It's called Craigavandee, with a panorama in the background. And what I'm just going to do is to illustrate how you can simply improve a picture just by choosing your point of view and walking around a subject, and just a few basic things to look out for. So if my students want to gather around, I'm not going to be asking them to take pictures, but it's just a bit of theory. Okay, firstly, standing at a bit like the waterfalls we were at earlier on, if you stand at eye level, then everything's spread out in front of you. Do you remember the principle we're talking about? If you go lower down, effectively you take the middle ground out of the picture and the picture just becomes about foreground and background. So if you both go through the exercise, just by looking down and seeing the difference, down, like that, then you can see you're taking the middle ground out. You've also noticed, if we stand back up again, that the one dominant feature we've got here is the road. Cuts through the middle of the picture. Again, using a low viewpoint takes the road out of the picture as well. So it's a very good way of controlling what's in the image and what's not. If you want to have everything spread out, and sometimes you do because you want a feeling of depth, then go high. If you want to squeeze the picture into foreground, background and simplicity, then choosing a low viewpoint. Other thing to look out for, if I wanted a wider view, in a similar way as we talked before, if I wanted a wider view, I go with landscape format. If you just want to concentrate on a small feature, say a clump of grass, for example, or the hill in the background, then go to portrait format, because as I explained earlier, there's a much closer relationship between what's in the foreground and what's in the background. Other thing to be slightly careful of, when you're using a single focus point, which I think I've got most of you set on a single focus point, remember to look at where it's focusing on. If you've got a foreground feature, the single focus point might be focusing on that foreground feature. If it is, it's unlikely, because if it's very close to the camera, particularly if you're using a larger aperture, say something like f8 or larger, then the likelihood is you might be throwing the background out of focus because you're not getting sufficient depth of field. Just something to be mindful of. Be always aware of what the camera's focusing on. Ideally, I would be looking somewhere in the middle ground to take my focus point from somewhere in the middle ground, as opposed to in the immediate foreground or in the immediate background. Generally, the more critical that gets, the larger the aperture, the more critical that gets. The smaller the aperture, if you go down to f14, say f16, then you've got more depth of field, you've got more room to play with. The other thing I wanted to show you, the road. Now, the one way we've got used here to get rid of the road is to go lower down. Well, I have to say it looked more interesting with a bike on it, didn't it? Yeah, it did. If we go to the other side of the road, right, ignore the foreground rubbish. Okay, now just by moving to the other side of the road, you can see what was a line cutting through the middle of the picture, which rarely works unless it's very deliberate, has now become an S shape meandering into the distance, which actually, in a lot of composition, can you imagine the classic road disappearing through the American Midwest look? Okay, you have to use your imagination, but you know, you get the principle. Road disappearing off into the distance, meandering through the landscape, generally works well in composition terms. So just by moving from one side of the road to the other, we've turned the road which cuts through the picture into one that forms a meandering shape into the landscape. So just by moving from one side of the road to the other, we've changed the road from effectively what is a liability into an asset which we can actually use. At the moment, the sun's right behind us, very flat light. Try and use your imagination a bit. I try, it usually fails. But imagine the sun coming up, rain during the night. The sun at the moment rises about here. Rain during the night, the road will be wet. The sunlight backlights the road. If you ever remember driving along where the road is so bright you can barely see in front of you. Try and think about that in photographic terms. The road will form a very bright S shape. The rest of the landscape in comparison very, very dark. So you can actually use that to almost form an abstract landscape picture where you've got a single streak, an S shape, a bright S shape, everything else very dark. So you have to use your imagination slightly because it's a question of using backlighting. It's a question of the fact that the sun lights up the road. If you expose for the road, the camera will turn everything else black and you end up with some very abstract, sort of interesting landscapes. What we've seen just by simply moving across the road, how we can turn a road, which is a liability in the picture, you want it out of the way, to one which we can actually use as part of the composition. We've also seen how we can use landscape or portrait format to emphasize parts of the picture, to focus the eye on the foreground or the background, or maybe open up the image to a wider view. Either way, try practicing your viewpoints and varying your viewpoints to get different effects. Don't forget that in digital photography, it's all the cost of a memory card. Just experiment. This is Nigel Forster for Photo Training for You, saying thanks very much and see you again soon.